I never cared much for HOA politics. As long as my house was in good shape and my lawn wasn't an overgrown jungle, I figured I'd be left alone. But that was before Karen decided I was her next target. Karen wasn't just the HOA president, she was the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood, a dictator wrapped in beige cardigans and passive-aggressive smiles. She thrived on control, weaving an intricate web of pointless rules and impossible standards. Flower pots had to be a precise shade of taupe. Christmas decorations were allowed only for 14 days, not a second more. Trash bins left visible for more than 3 hours. Expect a nasty letter taped to your door. The worst part? Nobody dared to challenge her. The HOA board was nothing more than her personal echo chamber, rubber-stamping every ridiculous policy she came up with. I had managed to stay under the radar, until the day I found an official HOA notice in my mailbox. At first, I laughed, thinking it had to be a mistake. The letter, printed on unnecessarily thick stationery, declared that my parked car, sitting in my own driveway, was a visual obstruction and didn't align with the community aesthetic. I almost crumpled it up right then and there. It was absurd. There were plenty of other cars parked in driveways, some much older and in far worse condition than mine. That evening, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed her standing across the street, arms crossed, watching me with that smug little smirk. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, this wasn't about my car. This was personal. But I had no idea just how far she was willing to go. The next morning, I stepped outside with my coffee in hand and nearly choked at the sight before me. Overnight, someone had placed massive landscaping boulders across my driveway. And by boulders, I don't mean a few decorative rocks, I mean giant, immovable slabs of stone, each the size of a small car, perfectly positioned to ensure that my vehicle, still inside the garage, wasn't going anywhere. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to process what I was seeing. Maybe it was a mistake. A construction crew mixing up addresses. But then, as if on cue, I caught a glimpse of Karen across the street. She was standing on her porch, sipping tea, watching me with the same satisfied expression of a queen surveying her conquered land. I didn't even hesitate. I marched straight over, fury bubbling under my skin. "Karen," I said, barely keeping my voice steady, "what the hell is this?" She barely glanced up from her teacup. "Oh, those? The HOA approved them. Lovely, aren't they?" I blinked. "Approved them? You blocked my driveway." She smiled, the same sickly sweet expression she always used when she thought she was in control. "The new guidelines allow for decorative rock features in common areas." I clenched my jaw. "This isn't a common area, Karen. It's my driveway." She let out a dramatic sigh. "Technically, all visible property contributes to the community aesthetic. And since you refused to comply with the guidelines, we took appropriate steps to ensure the neighborhood maintains its charm." My fingers curled into fists. "Move them. Now." She took another slow sip of tea. "You're free to submit a removal request to the board. The next meeting is in 3 weeks." I stared at her, half expecting her to break into a grin and admit this was some elaborate joke. But Karen never joked. Not when it came to her precious rules. I tried the reasonable routes first. I called the HOA board, hoping someone would intervene, but they either didn't answer or fed me vague, dismissive responses, clearly too afraid to cross Karen. The city zoning office was equally useless. Since the boulders weren't blocking a public street, they said it was a civil issue between me and the HOA. That's when Karen took things a step further. 2 days later, I received another official notice in the mail, this time, a violation for an unapproved fence height on my property. Except, I didn't even have a fence. I stormed over to Karen's house, violation letter in hand. She opened the door, smiling as if she had been expecting me. Something wrong? You know damn well I don't have a fence, I snapped, waving the paper. She tilted her head, her expression the very picture of condescending politeness. Well, the HOA keeps very detailed records. If you received a notice, there must be a violation. I laughed dryly, shaking my head. So, this is how it is? If you can't trap me with the boulders, you'll just start making things up? Her smile didn't waver. The HOA is simply ensuring compliance. That was when I realized, Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was deliberately manufacturing them to punish me for standing up to her. And she wasn't done yet. Later that evening, I had to park my car on the street since my driveway was still blocked. The next morning, I stepped outside to find my car gone. Confused, I called the towing company and was informed that someone had reported my vehicle as abandoned. It didn't take a genius to figure out who. As I walked back up to my house, fuming, I saw Karen watching from her front porch, sipping her tea like it was a sporting event. She gave me a little wave. That was it. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to destroy her. I wasn't going to let Karen win. Not this time. I spent the next few nights digging into every HOA regulation, city ordinance, and property law I could find. If she wanted to use bureaucracy as a weapon, I'd beat her at her own game. I scoured legal forums, read through cases of HOA overreach, and even contacted a few lawyers for advice. That's when I found it, the perfect loophole. Karen had been so obsessed with flexing her authority that she'd overstepped her legal bounds without realizing it. My driveway, despite being visible from the street, was legally classified as private property, not a common area. That meant the HOA had zero authority to alter it. Even better, city code strictly prohibited obstructions that impeded residential ingress and egress. In simpler terms, Karen had violated the law by blocking my driveway. Armed with this information, I contacted a lawyer named James, a sharp, no-nonsense guy who took one look at my case and nearly laughed. "This is a slam dunk," he said. "Not only can we force them to remove the boulders, but we can also go after them for damages." But before jumping straight to a lawsuit, I had something else in mind. Karen had weaponized bureaucracy against me, so I figured it was only fair to return the favor. The next morning, I made a very specific phone call to the city's fire marshal. I explained, in great detail, that large, immovable boulders had been placed in front of my driveway and were preventing emergency vehicle access. The fire marshal's tone immediately shifted from polite curiosity to serious concern. "That's a safety violation," he said. "We'll send someone to check it out." I made sure I was outside when the fire department vehicle rolled into the neighborhood. The sirens were off, but the lights flashed ominously, drawing the attention of every neighbor on the block. A uniformed fire marshal, Captain Reynolds, stepped out, clipboard in hand, and headed straight for the boulders. Karen, who had been outside watering her already perfectly manicured lawn, spotted them and went rigid. For the first time since this entire ordeal started, she looked genuinely uncertain. She set down her watering can and strode over, her face a carefully crafted mask of calm. "Good morning," Captain Reynolds said, flipping through his paperwork. "Are you the homeowner here?" Before I could answer, Karen jumped in. "I'm the HOA president." "What seems to be the issue?" Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow, glancing between us before turning back to the boulders. "We received a report that these rocks are obstructing a residential driveway, which is a violation of city code. Emergency vehicles need to have clear access at all times." Karen's smile twitched, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, I understand your concern, but this is part of an approved neighborhood beautification project. The homeowner was properly notified." I stepped forward, barely containing my grin. "Yeah, I was notified, after my driveway was blocked." Captain Reynolds didn't look impressed. He pulled out a measuring tape, took notes, and walked around the boulders, his expression turning more serious by the second. After a moment, he clicked his pen and turned back to Karen. "These boulders pose a significant obstruction to emergency access," he said. "If an ambulance or fire truck needed to reach this residence, they'd be unable to. This is a direct safety violation." Karen's face turned a lovely shade of crimson. But we have regulations." Captain Reynolds cut her off. "I'm not here to discuss HOA regulations. I'm here to enforce city code. You have 24 hours to remove these boulders, or the city will remove them at your expense. If that happens, you'll also be fined for obstruction of emergency services." Silence. Karen opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. She had no way out. She tried to argue, stall, and negotiate, but Captain Reynolds wasn't interested. He handed her a violation notice and walked away, leaving her fuming on the sidewalk. For the first time in her reign, Karen wasn't in control. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat, not even when backed into a corner. That night, while most of the neighborhood had likely gone to bed, she made her next move. I heard the rumbling of heavy equipment around midnight. Peering through my window, I watched as a landscaping crew arrived under the cover of darkness. Karen was outside, clipboard in hand, directing them like a deranged stage manager, her voice sharp and urgent. The workers adjusted the boulders, but only slightly. It was just enough to make it look like she was complying without actually clearing my driveway. I nearly laughed. She thought she was clever. The next morning, Captain Reynolds returned, clipboard in hand, eyes immediately narrowing at the barely altered obstruction. He didn't waste time. No warnings. No second chances. He pulled out his phone, made a quick call, and within hours, a city-commissioned crew arrived with equipment far larger and stronger than Karen's petty landscaping team. Karen stormed outside, but before she could even open her mouth, Captain Reynolds handed her a new violation notice. This time, it wasn't just an order for immediate removal, it came with a hefty fine attached. Her face drained of color. The city wasn't just forcing her to remove the boulders, she was now financially on the hook for every bit of nonsense she'd orchestrated. For the first time, she had no control over the situation. But that didn't mean she was finished. Later that evening, I received a notice for an emergency HOA meeting. Karen had called it last minute, clearly desperate to rally support and reassert her power. When I arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Karen stood at the front, flanked by her usual loyalists on the HOA board, her expression one of thinly veiled rage. She cleared her throat, addressing the room in her most authoritative voice. "There have been serious violations of HOA policies that must be addressed," she began, scanning the faces of the homeowners. "Certain individuals have repeatedly disregarded community standards and disrupted the harmony of our neighborhood." She didn't say my name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. Then came the real bombshell. Karen declared that due to my multiple infractions, the HOA had the right to review my standing as a homeowner and consider my removal from the neighborhood. I almost laughed out loud. She was trying to evict me. The sheer audacity of it would have been impressive if it weren't so ridiculous. I glanced around the room, expecting to see the usual nervous compliance, but something was different this time. A few neighbors exchanged glances. A murmur spread through the room. Some of them, ones who had been too afraid to speak up before, now looked angry. And then, the real nail in Karen's coffin came from the back of the room. "I'd like to bring something to everyone's attention," a voice said. Heads turned as Mr. Whitaker, one of the longest-standing HOA board members, stood up, holding a small recording device. Karen's face went pale. The recording clicked on, and her voice filled the room. It was a recording from one of her private meetings, one she hadn't expected anyone to hear. Her voice was sharp, dripping with condescension. We need to get rid of him. He's a problem. If I can't get him with the boulders, we'll find another way." The room fell into stunned silence. Karen's face twisted in pure panic. Whitaker turned to the rest of the board. "This is the woman who claims to enforce fairness? Who claims to act in the best interests of the community? She's been fabricating violations, abusing power. And now, she's actively conspiring against a homeowner." Murmurs turned into outright outrage. Someone from the back of the room called for a vote. Karen tried to stop it. She tried to talk over the noise, to argue, to regain control, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Karen's last stand had just crumbled beneath her feet. Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. Even after the recording exposed her scheming, even after the HOA board turned against her, she still believed she could weasel her way out of consequences. That's what made watching her squirm in court so satisfying. She strutted into the courtroom like she owned the place, dressed in a stiff blazer and clutching a thick binder filled with whatever nonsense arguments she had prepared. She barely acknowledged me as she sat down, tapping her nails against the table like this was just another HOA meeting where she could bully people into submission. But this wasn't her turf. She wasn't dealing with a group of homeowners afraid of fines, she was up against the legal system. James, my lawyer, laid everything out methodically. He started with the fire marshal's report, emphasizing that the boulders had not only blocked my driveway but had also been a serious safety hazard. Then he presented photographic evidence, showing just how massive the obstructions were and proving that they had been deliberately placed to trap my car. Finally, he pulled out the HOA bylaws, highlighting that Karen had unilaterally approved modifications to private property, something she had no authority to do. Karen, still clinging to whatever power she thought she had, launched into a dramatic monologue about protecting neighborhood standards and ensuring compliance. She painted herself as a noble defender of community values, trying to frame me as some kind of serial rule-breaker. The judge wasn't buying it. He let her ramble for a few minutes before finally cutting in, rubbing his temple as if she had already exhausted his patience. "Miss Henderson," he said dryly, "are you seriously arguing that placing boulders in front of someone's driveway was a reasonable enforcement of HOA policy?" Karen straightened. It was a necessary action to ensure compliance. The judge raised an eyebrow. "So instead of issuing a simple warning or a fine, you resorted to physically obstructing their property?" Karen opened her mouth. Then closed it. The judge sighed, flipping through some paperwork before delivering the final blow. "Based on the evidence presented, it's clear that the defendant acted outside her authority, caused undue hardship, and created a public safety issue. I'm ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Miss Henderson, you will pay all legal fees and damages totaling $12,000. The courtroom fell silent. Karen's mouth twitched as she processed what had just happened. $12,000, she sputtered. Yes, Miss Henderson, the judge replied, unimpressed. And I'd advise against any further acts of retaliation, or you'll find yourself facing even greater consequences. The gavel came down. It was over. Karen stormed out of the courtroom without so much as a glance in my direction, muttering under her breath as if she was the real victim in all of this. But the damage was done. Word spread like wildfire. The lawsuit shattered her iron grip on the HOA, and with neighbors emboldened by her public humiliation, they started pushing for her immediate removal. Within weeks, a petition circulated and passed with an overwhelming majority. Karen was officially stripped of her position. But her punishment didn't end there. With no power left, no allies on the board, and a neighborhood that openly celebrated her downfall, Karen did the only thing she could: she put her house up for sale and left. The HOA, now under reasonable leadership, rolled back many of her ridiculous policies. Petty fines were eliminated. The absurd aesthetic rules were relaxed. And for the first time in years, HOA meetings weren't about control and intimidation, they were actually about the community. A few months later, at our first neighborhood barbecue without her, someone had the brilliant idea to bring a decorative rock cake. An inside joke. The perfect symbol of her failed tyranny. As I took a bite and looked around at my now peaceful neighborhood, I realized something: justice, when served correctly, is absolutely delicious. So tell me, have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.